Hi, I'm Nicholas Hartlep, and this is the Model Minority Stereotype Project, where we talk about all things Asian American and academic. I have the pleasure of hosting and moderating this panel with uh, four amazing colleagues, uh, academics, activists. Um, I want to just introduce them a little bit, and then we will dive into the questions that we've prepared for you today. Dr. Soyeon An is an associate professor of social studies education at Kennesaw State University. She received BS and MS degrees in social studies education from Seoul National University in South Korea and a PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Since 2009, she has been teaching and researching in the field of social studies education. Her work is informed by scholarship on AsianCrit, critical race theory, critical pedagogy, and global citizenship. As a critical race scholar, elementary social studies teacher educator, and immigrant mother of Asian American children, she studies, teaches, and parents with a hope for anti-racist, anti-oppressive school and society for all children. Some of her works are published in Journal of Curriculum Studies, Theory and Research in Social Education, Journal of Social Studies Research, and Social Studies Research and Practice. Our second panelist is Dr. Ariel Ashley. She is an assistant professor of college counseling and student development at St. Cloud State University. Her research centers on the racialized experiences of transracial Asian American adoptees in higher education, autoethnography as transformative methodology, and women of color empowerment and critical consciousness in the academy. Dr. Ashley is co-founder of Ashley Consulting, where alongside her life and business partner, she provides brave space for bold conversations. In addition to co-writing Vital, a torch for your social justice journey, and authoring several book chapters, Dr. Ashley has been published in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, the International Journal of Multicultural Education, and the Journal of Student Affairs Research and Practice. Our third panelist, Dr. Christian Chan, is an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling and Educational Development at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, president-elect of the Association for Adult Development and Aging, AADA, and a proud queer person of color. As a scholar activist, his interests revolve around intersectionality, multiculturalism, and counseling practice, supervision and counselor education, social justice and activism, career development, critical research methodologies, and couple, family, and group modalities with socialization, communication of culture, and social identities. Our next panelist is Mai Chow Dudek. She is a Hmong American artist, author, and social justice educator at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. She is the senior equity advisor and recruiter to the School of Education. She holds a Wisconsin lifetime teaching license in art education and has a breadth of teaching experiences across K-16 educational settings. She is on track to graduate in 2021 with a doctorate and education degree in student affairs administration leadership. Mai Chow's research interests focus on Hmong American women and learning environments that are culturally responsive to meet their needs so they thrive in higher education. She is the proud author of a multicultural historical novel called Gathering Fireflies, published in 2015. So what I had thought about doing today and we had planned is I wanted to get a diverse group of panelists to share their thoughts, certainly also kind of a shout out Saturday about their own work. In the academy, my thought and experience has been Asian Americans, we're kind of put in the corner, and oftentimes our research isn't shared or disseminated like other scholars. And so I hope today's episode will bring attention to these scholars' work, and then also will cultivate some conversation. So we can do however we want, but the first question I want to pose to you panelists are, tell us a little bit about your identity. So anyone wants to go can lead us off. Christian, why don't you go first?
It's so funny. I was going to go ahead and jump in, but Sure. So for me, the way that I would describe my identities, and this is pretty central to a lot of the work that I do in terms of the bread and butter of my work of intersectionality. And I think in many ways, of course, like part of that stems from my own lived experiences living in the world and showing up in the world as a queer person of color. And so when I start to wrestle with those identities and grapple with them, of course, like in many ways, I show up as someone who is a queer person of color, but also somebody who has multiple heritages and who's a second generation Asian American. And so in particular, when I think about how I describe my identity, I have a lot of, I place a lot of attention, particularly around many of my heritages, right? That I'm Filipino, Chinese, and Malaysian. And, that can certainly, that's a conversation for another day in terms of the ways that that's enriched my life and the ways that it's also made it much more complicated, right? But the other aspects that I would certainly want to identify, especially as I think about what that's meant for me, right, is that I'm not only just a queer person of color, and just a queer second generation Asian American, but I'm also a cisgender male and an able-bodied person. And I think in many ways that those forms of privilege are magnified. And that's something that I consistently discuss in the way that I teach students and in the way that I broach some of these cultural factors, particularly among research teams. It's certainly a way that we think reflexively about the work that we're doing and the kinds of biases that show up, the kinds of ways that we select particular forms of data, and the ways that we even write about the data, right? So I think I live in that world a lot, but the last piece last two pieces I wanted to share about how I describe my identity. So I am someone who grew up with as a child of two immigrants, and two immigrants who, when they migrated to the United States, like did face economic hardship and their own journeys of economic hardship. And I think for me, that doesn't discount the fact that I also grew up with the privilege of having access to education and career opportunities, and I think most importantly, even a PhD. And so in many ways that I grew up with that privilege in terms of a middle-class family. And the other piece I want to highlight is even just the spiritual identity and meaning making that I center in my own work, right? So as someone who is a pluralistic Catholic, who's centered in liberation theology, in many ways, so much of our work, right, is that how do I grapple with the idea of social justice and activism, particularly as it relates to spiritual meaning making, and how some communities find their own spiritual meaning making through their community activism. So I know that was really wordy, but I hope, it's like I couldn't mention one without having all these intersections come to light.
On this video, we have a grid, so why don't we just go in the circle on my screen. So Yan, do you want to talk about your identity?
Sure. Okay, so my name is Soyeon. First of all, I'm first generation Asian American, so I'm immigrant from South Korea. So that's a huge thing. Before coming to the United States, never thought of myself as an Asian, right? Like in Korea, I'm just Korean. The majority of us, 98%, all look like me. So race or the ethnicity maybe, rather than ethnicity, it's more about the nationality. So we thinking about we are Korean, and Chinese, there's Japanese. So for now, for more than 20 years since being in the United States. So for me, being Asian American, first generation Asian American, also immigrant from South Korea, that's a huge thing. And then on top of that, being a mother, that's also kind of complicated. Not complicated, it's kind of also complicated, but also a blessing. It's a blessing who I am as a mother. I also strongly identify myself as teacher educator. I have a huge, big passion about the teaching, being a teacher educator, and also curriculum scholar. So all being Asian American, Korean immigrants, mother, teacher educator, and curriculum scholar, those are, I think, my who I am, who shapes that shapes my work.
Great, thank you. Mai Chao, do you want to talk about your identity?
Yes. So I'm Mai Chao. Thank you for having us here, Nicholas. I appreciate it. I identified as a first-generation Hmong American, and my roots go back to China, then Laos, then Thailand, and finally to the United States in 1992. So that's when my family finally came to America. And so my art, my writing, and my scholarly research explores the themes of what it means to be a Hmong American woman in predominantly white spaces. And I'm very interested and passionate about cultural responsive and sustainability pedagogy, especially in K-16 education. And I feel with my love of culture, and also as a scholar, it's so important for me to create research that decolonizes just Western ideas of, you know, what is knowledge, what is wisdom, and such. And so I think through art, writing, and research, I'm able to have a voice which adds to my identity. And I appreciate what Christian said about the intersectionality of multiple pieces. Like, I can't talk about myself without mentioning multiple pieces of my parents, my culture, who I am. Yeah. So that's all.
Thank you. Last but not least, Ariel, do you want to talk about your identity?
Sure. Thanks again so much, Nicholas, for hosting all of us. This is actually the first time that I've had a chance to connect with this particular group of scholars. And just in hearing you describe how you walk through the world, how you perceive your own identity, the people and experiences that give you each such kind of rich perspectives, I can't wait to like follow up and have further conversations about some of the different things that have already come up. So as Nicholas shared, my name is Ariel Ashley. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And for me, identity is kind of at the crux, the center of how I understand my work as a scholar activist. And it's very contextual. So when I'm in different times and different spaces, different aspects of my identity are more or less salient. So kind of where I'm situated right now in this time and place, in this, you know, spring afternoon in a time of COVID, right, this unprecedented context. Some of the identities that are at the forefront of my mind are my experience as an Asian American, and particularly as an East Asian American, and the ways in which I'm navigating a heightened sense of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian hate and bias in light of COVID. I also identify as a transracial and transnational adoptee. So that means I was born in Korea and then adopted and raised in the US by a white family. And that particular socialization has been hugely formative to how I walk through the world and how I understand myself and my surroundings. I also identify as a cisgendered, heterosexual, partnered, married, mother of a multiracial child. And these relational identities have become more and more salient. I spent an early part of my career kind of really examining the ways in which social identities are structured and, you know, paying really attention to the ways in which power and oppression kind of have played out in my life specifically. And I'm in a place now where I'm also thinking about what it means to be a mom and how that impacts and is impacted by my race, my class, my gender, etc. Christian, you mentioned liberation theology. Yes, would love to have a whole conversation about that. So I identify as a multi-faith Christian, or a Christian in a multi-faith marriage. And I have really come to find a lot of grounding in my social justice activism and work, in my spirituality and my religious identity. I also am very mindful in this time of COVID that I'm employed as a PhD, right, as a faculty member, and someone that has financial and economic stability, at least right now, whereas many people are not experiencing that. So those are just some of the identities that are at the forefront of my mind in this time and place.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's really important to start with, you know, who you are and your identity. So thank you for that. So my question to Christian, where do you work? What do you do professionally? I mean, walk us through, you can answer that however you want, but maybe, you know, the day in the life of Dr. Chan, what are you up to these days?
So I think I think it's like when you're pre-tenured faculty, right? It's almost like you never get a break. But I think in many ways, in so much of a lot of my work in terms of service, leadership, scholarship, and research, I usually focus primarily on especially racial equity. I think that's particularly been a major part of my work right now. And especially I just walked out of teaching our doctoral course or advanced multicultural course for our doc students. And I run that course very much like a critical research methodologies course. So where a lot of students are trying to grapple with some of the paradigms that they could implement, not only as they see it in terms of research paradigms, but how they also implement it in the scope of activism and in the scope of teaching, right? Because I am a faculty who's housed in a counselor education, in the counselor education world. And so, and I think in many ways, some of the reception of critical research methodologies, it's like, sort of like, in some ways, it's like it's there and it's not. Like, it still feels very new for counselor ed, which is really interesting because, I mean, in some ways it isn't. I think in the last, I would say it's grown a lot in the last 5 to 8 years, but I really want the counseling profession to really mainstream that into the work that we're doing, because it's not just us using it as like a type of buzzword, but really in a way that we're really speaking and invoking some of the lived experiences that, you know, that aren't just about examining multiple forms of oppression, but really like looking at the ways that this has been incorporated or really integrated into many of the social structures that we're seeing across generations and across time. And so I think in some of the work that I've been certainly attending to is certainly critical research methodologies, intersectionality, and racial equity. And so I think in many ways what I've been doing, of course, is like doing a lot of, I do a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings for academic units, because I think in many ways they need, sometimes it's almost like they need an outside facilitator to talk about these conversations. Because I think many academic units are not even having this conversation, and some are dealing with significant issues within groups and like the workplace. And I think in some capacity, that's where we see a lot of these different forms of racial inequity show up, right? And it really, it heightens a lot of individual and collective experiences of racial trauma. And I think that's the other piece here. And I think we're seeing that, especially with this group of brilliant and phenomenal scholars, that we're seeing that even through all of our different spaces in the United States with COVID-19. And so. Absolutely.
And Christian, you know, when part of my thought with this video for others is, so sharing about your work. So now I'm immediately going to be like, oh, if someone's like, I need a trainer, I'll be like, oh, I know Dr. Chan would be perfect for you. So it's a great networking piece too, to hear what everyone's engaged with, collaborations, future writing, and just in general. I mean, Christian, we met at AERA, and I don't know this level of your work, so thank you for sharing that. So Yan, what about you? Where do you work, and what are you up to these days?
So I work at Kennesaw State University, which is located in Georgia. So for me, like Kennesaw State is a quite teaching-centered university. So I pretty much like work with the elementary pre-service teachers, elementary in-service teachers, and my curriculum area is like elementary social studies curriculum. So my teaching is all around like how to help pre-service and in-service elementary school teachers, and how they can rethink what social studies education is all about, right? It's not about food and holidays. It's not all about white people's history. It's not about all like 4th of July. Let's all celebrate being American is being, you know, white middle class with celebrating 4th of July, or patron means this or that kind of thing. So for me, like the biggest, I think my duty, and also like I'm passionate about, is about how can I, like, you know, meet with my students, like the elementary school teachers, like, you know, to rethinking and also like rethinking and also disrupting the way that like a traditional elementary social studies curriculum. So my teaching so I could say centers around the elementary social curriculum and pedagogy. So and also like related to that, like my research, my scholarship also center on the elementary social studies education and also teacher education. But it's more about my scholarship is about the curriculum study. So using Asian critical race theory and using other critical theories, looking at elementary social curriculum and debunking and disrupting how it's white-centered, how the white supremacy is like, you know, shaping the master narrative that is reflected in our, whether it's a social studies textbook or the official state standard. So that's my work. Currently with all this COVID, right, as a mother, seeing like helping navigating together with my kids to dealing with all this social distancing and remote schooling, but then also like working with my students who for the first time in their life too, like, you know, face-to-face class all turning into online, and we are grappling together. But then also I'm writing about, you know, at social studies at NCS, the National Council for the Social Studies. We are writing about like the statement about anti-Asian hate in middle of COVID and what the role of the social studies field. So that's currently I'm working on. Yeah, surviving and try to, to supporting my kids, try to being like a sane, right?
Yeah.
So
well, you publish a lot too. So on top of, like you said, your institution might be teaching, you have to do everything well, you know, and so yeah, thank you. My child, what about you? Tell us a little bit about what you're up to.
So my job title says one thing and I do like 100 other things. But I'll focus on like 3 or 4 of the main things. I work in the School of Education, and in the state of Wisconsin, I would say a high percentage, like over 90% of our teachers are white, and most of them are female. In the school district that I taught in 2016, I was one of 24 teachers of color out of 500 teachers. So just to give you some context of what my environment looks like. So in the School of Ed, one of my roles is to work with multicultural students who are pursuing teacher certification. And so I advise them, I connect them to resources so that they could be successful. So resources meaning like, you know, the required standardized tests that they have to pass. And if they need financial assistance, I connect them to different people on campus. In addition to that, I also write grants to support a program called Grow Our Own Teacher Diversity. And so this program is special because it's a full ride scholarship. The grants that I receive, the money goes straight to support students who come from diverse backgrounds. So it could be single parents, it could be first generation low income and such. So it's important work. And I think the joys of it is seeing the support that comes in to help grow more teachers of color, given that the stats are so incredibly low. And so one of the ways to respond to that is to build small programs that support the increase of students of color in the School of Ed. Another piece that I do is I collaborate with faculty and administrators to infuse more cultural relevance into their curriculum. So we talk about white identity development, and then also the opposite, to empower students of color. You know, how can you bring your knowledge into the classroom so that when all students see you, you're not just a role model or a mentor, but you are the catalyst that will help them see themselves in these roles. And so it's fascinating. I love what I do. And yeah, I think the vast majority of them is just figuring out how to bring resource in so that we can grow our teachers and increase that number in the classroom. So.
And my child, when you finish with your doctorate, will you, are you doing faculty or staying in your current position, thinking, or at some point?
That's a great question. So I have a year left. I'm so excited. I can't wait. Like I said, the joy of and the privilege of having opportunities to pick and choose. Like I have every opportunity to be a faculty member, but because I taught in K-12, I realized how important it is to be an administrator. And so although my calling is, and my resume is all education, I should be a faculty. I know that I need to be an administrator. So when I'm done, I'm going to be an administrator in higher ed. Yeah.
Lovely.
Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Thank you, my child. Dr. Ashley?
So right now I work at St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. And it's so funny when you ask the question, Nicholas, like, where do we work and what is it that we're doing? I think in part because of COVID, or maybe it's because it's right at the end of the term. And so the flexibility or the perceived freedom of summer has me kind of thinking more expansively. I'm not sure. But I think of my work absolutely connected to my home campus, St. Cloud State, but also as really being beyond campus in terms of the relationships that I can build, the communities that I can help organize and mobilize, not just within the ivory tower, within higher ed contexts, but more broadly as well. So some of the different projects that I'm working on right now, I'm working on a book project around identity interconnections. So the ways in which we might experience similarities and also need to tend to the differences between some of our identities that might allow us to have greater empathy for one another. So for instance, as a transracial adoptee, my experience is distinctly different than, for instance, a multiracial or multi-ethnic person. And yet, both of us likely experience transgressing, disrupting monoracism as a system. And so how can we explore the identity interconnections, the ways in which we might have a unique perspective together that can allow me to show up more effectively as an ally to my multiracial, multi-ethnic brothers and sisters, and vice versa, to raise visibility for transracial adoptees, perhaps within multiracial and multi-ethnic communities. So that's like one example of an identity interconnection. Working on a book project that's bringing together different scholars from a number of different disciplines to think about the ways in which identity interconnections can be pedagogically relative to help facilitate coalitions in ways that can really actualize social change. A lot of the work that I do and the projects I'm passionate about are on centering stories. So very much informed from a critical race perspective, just recognizing the importance and the power of counter narratives, particularly from perspectives and communities that have been historically oppressed or marginalized. And so I do that in my pedagogy. And so I'm starting to figure out what does it mean to write about how I do that in the classroom. But then also thinking about the different ways in which I can help center stories or empower students to center their stories in their own work, which is why autoethnography is such a transformative methodology, one that is not very common yet in higher education and student affairs, which is kind of my background, but I think is definitely gaining momentum. A lot of my interests more recently have been around post-structural explorations of identity, so the ways in which language can be limiting. Right? Race is real. Absolutely. There's no question of that. And how do we experience race and perhaps feel limited by the ways in which we conceptualized race because of our existing constructions? And what would it look like to imagine other possibilities that could perhaps be more liberatory than, thinking of like the hierarchies that exist within communities of color or the realities that we endure under a system of white supremacy? So my background is in student affairs and higher education. So my chow, I feel like there's a connection there. But I'm currently situated in a counseling and community psychology department. And so I feel like, Christian, there's a connection there. And so I think this experience of kind of being in between different spaces. So again, something you mentioned about your experience as an immigrant mother, I think relates and resonates. While I was only in Korea for a few months as an infant, I think trying to understand what it means to exist as both and as perhaps, both a practitioner or an administrator, as well as a scholar, as both someone who has Korean roots and ancestry, but also very much an Americanized and Western white perspective, continues to inform the collaborations that I undertake. One thing I just wanted to mention, I don't really know where this fits, but in this invitation to be a part of conversation with other Asian American thought leaders, one thing I was thinking about was the ways in which my perception anyways is that we represent kind of maybe a subset of Asian America. And so just trying to also maybe name and acknowledge who might not be in this space and the relevance and importance of their voices too. So whether that's thinking of South Asian brother and sister colleagues, thinking about the ways in which Pacific Islander communities may have similarities and yet unique differences from our experiences, just kind of in light of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, continuing to lean in and challenge to the ways that, Asian America is this political umbrella that we use and has great utility and can sometimes, I think, cloud or mask some of the really important diversity and heterogeneity within our community. So thanks again. Those are some of the projects I'm working on, and I look forward to having more conversations with each of you about potential connections in our work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ariel. So if you're watching this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to post, hopefully the panelists, if they're okay with it, they'll email me links to some of their work, articles, books, any of their website. I'm going to just drop that in the description. So take a look when this video is posted. Look in the description below. There'll be tons of information that you can get to know the panelists more. Because I have one more question and then we'll wrap up this session, this video. But again, if you're watching and you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. You'll know when new content's uploaded. And I'm thinking it's Friday when we're taping this video. It'll be more of a shout out Saturday video for all of these folks here. And like Ariel said, subsequent videos, I'd love to have more interviews, different content. I was thinking about doing session, my child, you talked about, writing grants. Maybe we can have some experts come in and talk about here is how you can write grants. So we talk about Asian American broadly, but things that pertain to academic life. So I guess I'd like to ask the final question for you all. And the question is, what does being an Asian/Asian American professor/academic, however you want to identify yourself, what does it mean to you during this time of COVID, especially considering the role uncertainty of education in society and or the rise of anti-Asian racism? Soyan, you mentioned a little bit about what you're currently engaged with, but Christian, could you start? And I'd like to hear from all of the panelists, maybe explain as broadly or specifically as you feel comfortable with.
Sure. And I think, there are two major components of, like, even when I think about teaching and my life as a faculty member, that I'm teaching at the master's and doctoral levels. And so I'm teaching master's students to become practitioners, professional counselors, and they're going to be employed in a variety of different settings: school counselors, clinical mental health counselors, marriage, couple, and family counselors, and student affairs counselors. And I think in many ways, we're seeing that come to light. But then the other level is that I'm also teaching doctoral students in counselor education who are going to become faculty. That has been their ultimate goal in terms of their career. And the one issue I think I want to highlight is that sometimes what has been happening too is almost like, I think in light of so many of the different concerns that we're seeing right now in terms of COVID-19, that, I'm very firmly grounded in what I do with culturally responsive practices, right? And I think a lot of my students know that I'm not someone who's going to sugarcoat things. And I'm very, very active in saying and naming the fact that what we are experiencing collectively for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities is very much like, this is racism. This is exactly what it is. And we're seeing it interpersonally and structurally, right? And we're seeing racial violence happen in a variety of different ways. And so we're seeing that happen in very explicit forms, but then also very implicitly, right? Where it does not always feel safe to actually be outside and to actually, like, you know, just gather in the community, because you just never know, especially because some of the instances have been so harmful. And of course, we see that in terms of communities, right? That in terms of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, that incurs not only community trauma in terms of that racial violence and racial trauma, but that community trauma also spans generations, right? It gets passed down, and that generational trauma continues to occur. And so I think one of the ways that I think about why I work with in terms of students, practitioners, even student consultation, that I often tell people, it's like, okay, well, you can't wait for your clients or students to just bring that up to you, right? Like, you actually have to actively broach some of these cultural factors and know that this is exactly what's happening, even if some of our communities are not naming it as such, but this is exactly what's happening. And I think in many ways, I think some of the conversations too, it's almost like, you know, I'm gonna mention Janet Helms's especially racial identity development and the white identity development model, but there have been a lot of instances where we see pseudo-independence, right? Where it often becomes, oh, well, you know, we see in terms of where, in terms of white identity development, for white communities and white individuals, that they say, oh, well, you know, I think racism is a problem, but I think people of color need to manage it and to handle it and to address it. They need to be the ones to resolve it. And I think, you know, there have been certain concerns with even some of the leaders who have adopted that and said, like, well, you know, Asian American Pacific Islander communities need to be the ones to manage the whole situation around COVID-19. And so that's when, you know, it's like when we're seeing like people get angry about it and protesting, I'm like, this is exactly what we need to be doing in terms of some of our activist work, right? But also in a variety of settings. So it's not just one way, but multiple ways.
Thank you. Soyeon?
Mm-hmm. So because my area is like, you know, subject area social studies, this is all about what does it mean to be American, right? Who belongs to America, where America has been and where we are now, where we are going when it comes to social studies and history education and civic education. So it's like a whole, to seeing this whole like craziness, it is a painful, but then also it's kind of like affirming, it kind of pushes me and motivates me that you need to do what you've been doing. So when it comes down to, you know, teaching, like, you know, elementary social studies teachers, if I don't like, you know, help my students, then elementary teachers will teach the social study history the way that they've been taught. It's all about white people's history. There's nothing about, and then also it's kind of sad, right? Like a COVID-19 and anti-Asian, like a hate and violence, but it's not new, nothing new, right? In our history, this is just another episode of this long history of racializing disease, and not only Asian American, all those vulnerable groups being racialized, and whenever the disease, or not just about disease, any like a social problem, like we are scapegoating, and Asian American has been one of those groups being discriminated, their human rights are violated. So I'll be doing the way I'll continue to do what I've been doing. So when it comes to like a social studies, I'm compelled to bring more Asian American history as counter narrative to our official curriculum. Otherwise, it's all starting from the, you know, George Washington, Lincoln, and then all great, like, you know, after World War II is a great war, and now we are here. So bringing Asian American history, and not only about using Asian American history as a counter narrative to the limitation or the politics or the ideology of behind the official social study or history curriculum. Not only that, bringing that our counters to our story as like a resource, right? There's a resources out there. It's not just about our criticizing the curriculum, but then, hey, see, teachers, here's children's books. Here's like, you know, the primary source. Here's all the diary. There's a primary source in children's book. And also particularly when it comes to elementary school, right? Teachers, my students often say, well, I know, like, we need to teach about this difficult history. We need to teach about the hard history. But then, well, kids are too young, right? Kids are too young. It's too harsh to talk about this anti-Asian violence or whatever they say the difficult history. But then there's a resource out there, like children's books and primary sources, and so that's I mean, teaching-wise in COVID-19, that also reaffirms and compels me to like doing, you know, teaching, helping the school teachers about like resources out there. Hey, it's possible to talk about this, you know, the race and xenophobia in an age-appropriate, but also not only by age-appropriate and rigorous way. And also when it comes down to scholarship, even in social studies field, the curriculum scholars keep debunking and, you know, challenging the master narrative, white supremacy in our curriculum. But there's still, like, there are not many researchers in our field to debunking the Asian America, how Asian America being marginalized, silenced, and our voices being misrepresented. So my curriculum research-wise, I'll be continue doing like making a voice, right? Making a noise. Hey, people, let's do this. We need to do this. So painful, but then it's another, for me, it's an affirmation that, yeah, my work is important and I need to be doing, continue to be doing, and also working with others to, right, those who have the same mission to keep pushing our field to move forward. So that's where I am.
And again, Dr. An, if you send me some of those resources, I can put those in the description as well. The greatest joy that I get is people that watch this video hear different things and learn. I'm learning while we're doing this panel, and you're all doing amazing work. And the Academy, you know, if people aren't aware of those pockets, because we research these narrow kind of topics, certainly at times. I really look forward to taking anything you want and I can share it with the viewers, and so that they can learn more about your work. So as well as the National Council, the Social Studies, if you're doing a statement, we can post a link to that. So thank you. Mai Chao?
So I'll speak from the professional standpoint and the personal standpoint during this COVID time.
Sure.
The first point is, as a person in the School of Education, I always ask myself, how do I support my students? There's very specific cases that when our students go to interviews, especially students of color, they go to interviews at these smaller towns and they experience blatant racism or subtle microaggressions or biases. They're so hurt. And they're like, I'm not even a teacher yet. And I'm interviewing these towns. What do I do? Do I teaching? And so I think one of my roles is like, how do I comfort my students? What tools can I give them so that when they encounter these, it's not so shocking and it's not so painful, because I remember what it felt like to be in their shoes. And so professionally, these are some real things that are happening just this semester. And so I'm encouraged that many of us, regardless of our skin color, are coming together to like make a statement or to make changes in our ways of life or practices, so that when our students come to us, we can give them something that would comfort them. Personally, I think I'm scared sometimes going to the store because, you know, just clearing my throat and I get dirty looks as if I'm like sick or I'm like this walking virus, whatever they call it. It's like, it's ridiculous. It's like my partner is white and he doesn't have these inconveniences or these experiences or encounters. But when I'm linked to him, I notice it's less. But if it's just me and my biracial children, it's like, I don't know if I want to put myself out there if I'm in this environment. And so I'm encouraged that there's community folks who reach out and check on folks like us. That in itself is a privilege. I know that white folks reach out and say, hey, I noticed you're upset. What happened? How can I help you? You know, can I go with you next time you go to these spaces? And I'm like, wow, that's so nice. But what are you doing to change the system? Or what are you doing to help break other folks so that I don't have to show up, or people like me don't have to show up to these stores and be very uncomfortable with our children? And so it's taught me a lot, but I think just being courageous and talking, sharing my experiences so that other people are aware. Because, you know, some of my really good friends who are white want to do something about it. And so if they're aware, hopefully they will be intentional and be active in helping all of us dismantle a oppressive system that continues to make us feel uncomfortable. And so it's hard, but I'm encouraged that many people are working together collectively to do something about it. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for framing it in the personal and the professional way that, and it's scary that I'm with you. Dr. Ashley?
Sure. So I think first and foremost, because I'm situated in a counseling and community psychology department, I very much found my response to COVID really rooted in kind of like my helping skills foundation. And so I think I observed lots of people reacting to the uncertainty and the fear of kind of what was happening at the start of COVID in lots of different ways. For some folks, maybe grasping and trying to hold tighter to professional identities or certain stabilities or norms. And I kind of went the other direction and actually wrote to all of my students and said, like, hey, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know if you're employed any longer. I don't know if your family is healthy or not. So really tried to take a person-centered approach to my students to really allow them to be able to have some personal agency and discernment in a time where it felt like there was nothing in which we had any control over anymore. And so that meant that a lot of the assignments and a lot of the prep that I had done for, you know, the first year of faculty life kind of went out the window, and tending to students' personal wellness, like checking in emotionally, psychologically, you know, financially, how are people doing and what resources can I tap you into or get you connected to? Also, I serve on a national advisory board for a Korean American adoptee organization. And in light of COVID, have helped kind of create virtual community for that organization, just recognizing because of social distancing and stay-at-home orders, there's so many folks who are experiencing isolation during, you know, a time where there could be a lot of fear, a lot of perhaps exacerbated mental health issues and concerns. And so trying to kind of combat that through different informal happy hours or even community conversation spaces for transracial adoptees, for instance, to talk about the unique ways in which as transracial adoptees, perhaps we've been racialized and what that means for how we're processing COVID. So those are a couple of different things in terms of kind of how I responded in light of COVID. I think for me, the biggest takeaway from this, I don't know, time in life, this is, in my mind, COVID is not just a minor semester disruption, but it is truly a significant experience for humanity, dare I say. I think for me, it's been also an invitation as I'm very much forming my identity as an academic and what it means to be one of very few Asian American scholars in the academy, to think about how can I role model a way of being, a way of doing faculty life that is rooted in my values and that centers family and community and healing, rather than having that be an afterthought to productivity and publishing and everything else. And of course, you know, not trying to minimize the responsibilities and the privileges that we have as academics, but also kind of trying to maybe take COVID as an opportunity to disrupt some of what perhaps has been problematic in our society and the ways in which so many folks in the United States are completely, I think, professionally defined, myself included. But when all of a sudden you start to disrupt how we can engage in our professional lives by limiting the number of folks who can be going to work, I think there's an opportunity or an invitation to start to think, well, what does that mean? How was I spending my time? How was I defining my sense of self? And how might I explore new or different ways of being and relating? And I think that for me, as an Asian American, as a scholar activist, as a mother, as a Christian, that kind of broader philosophical question has been really meaningful. Certainly not to minimize the pain and suffering that exists with COVID, but also I think like all experiences, there can be both challenge and learning and opportunity.
Wonderful. As we draw this video to a close, I just want to share a few things. This is one component, using Zoom and then editing it to make a video for the YouTube channel. Another is actual live streaming videos for the channel. So if you're watching this video, you can also make a comment below for the panelists. So, right, you've watched this video, you've heard their thoughts, you might have a question. You can post that question. Optimally, the panelists subscribe to the channel, and then they can see that and they could respond. I'm going to put a bunch of links to their work, anything that they share, they want to share publicly. You can look them up online. We all have digital footprints nowadays. And so I hope this is just a beginning. So this is definitely a shout out Saturday to my lovely panelists. Thank you for taking your time, having the kids be quiet in the house or what have you. I'm in my daughter's bedroom right now. I'm like, please just be quiet here. And then another is, if you're watching this and you do work, you don't have to be Asian American or identify as such. But if you want to be on the channel, please send me a message and I'd love to interview you. We have upcoming videos on transracial adoptee folks doing work on Asian American adoptees. That will be forthcoming. And then some other resources, videos on podcasts and other tools to help you flourish in the academy. So with that, I just want to close the video and thank you for watching this video. Like, subscribe, and comment, and have a great day.